So this is the second in UUJAZ's series of justice strength trainings, webinars designed to build our justice building muscles, to strengthen us as a community and as individuals for the work of creating a more just Arizona. My name is Allison Wood, and I'm the Justice Coordinator for UUJAZ. And I will be helping to facilitate this webinar today. Just a note, I'm going to mute all of y'all for the duration of our presentation so that we don't get any extraneous background noises. And then after the presentation, we'll have some time for questions. And so you can either type your questions into the chat box as they come up, throughout the presentation, and Amy Beth will address them at the end, or, jot your questions down where you are to ask them later. Great. So we're really lucky today to hear from guest speaker, Amy Beth Willis, who's a Tucson-based organizer with the National Sanctuary Movement. Amy Beth has been working in justice building work for 5 years or more, since college, her early days in justice work, and has experience with the sanctuary movement through work in DC, in Washington, DC, and locally with Southside Presbyterian Church. Amy Beth is from, or was born in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or is from there most recently, and has studied sociology at Emory University, where she graduated in 2013. She connected with social movements and learned more about migration in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and then served with the Presbyterian Church Young Adult Volunteer Program here in Tucson and in Washington, D.C., further flexing those muscles of justice building that she's going to help us strengthen today. So now Amy Beth is a Tucson-based organizer with the National Sanctuary Movement, who works locally to organize communities here in solidarity and accompaniment work, and helps to organize the larger national movement, traveling to different places around the country to participate in conferences and to speak at different places and support directly impacted people and congregations seeking to be allies in real and meaningful and powerful ways. So I'm really excited to have Amy Beth here today, and I hope that you all will enjoy what she has to share. And at this point, I will turn it over to Amy Beth for this portion of the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Am I loud and clear? Thank you so much, Allie, for that introduction and for inviting me to share some information and stories and knowledge with you all today. That certainly is not my own knowledge to share, but comes from the many communities and people that I've had the privilege to work with over the past few years. So Allie asked me if I would reflect today on specifically on how the work of sanctuary, when we talk about that, means more than providing a physical space for someone who's facing deportation to stay, that it's a large umbrella under which we as people of faith can sit, stand, and march, and be involved in the work of solidarity with immigrant communities close by us. And we are very lucky and really blessed to be able to have such proximity to amazing organizers and communities who are really fighting for their lives. And so the more that we can do to educate ourselves on how we can best come alongside them only strengthens the movement as a whole. And I really feel that the most important thing we can do is to know how to participate in this work appropriately and effectively. So I hope that what I share with you today will be helpful, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you, and I know that the webinar will be recorded as well. So let's see if we can get the slide to change. Okay. All right. So I just want to do a brief overview of what Sanctuary is, where it comes from, just to catch everyone up on the same page. So you may or may not know that this idea of sanctuary actually dates back to the Levitical texts in the Hebrew Bible. Here is one such text wherein the Lord Yahweh commanded the people to set up cities of refuge for people who had been falsely accused of a variety of crimes. You may remember that in the Levitical code, the punishment for many crimes was very severe, and so having an opportunity, a safety valve, a place to flee, a place to seek refuge was an important way to really establish justice. And this is an idea that really developed through the centuries, not only in Jewish settings, but then once Christianity developed, dating all the way up until the medieval times when cathedrals were seen as safe places. You may recognize this image from the 1996 Hunchback of Notre Dame film, which takes place, it's supposed to take place in the end of the 15th century. And this is Quasimodo, the main character, who's bringing his the woman he's fallen in love with, Esmeralda, to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And in the scene, he actually shouts, "Sanctuary, sanctuary." And that might sound funny to kids watching it, but what he is actually claiming is that Esmeralda has been falsely accused of committing a crime. And so he's helping her actually find refuge in a place so that the issue can be worked out. Because we know that throughout history we have, as people reacted very strongly and very immediately to people who have committed crimes, and so an opportunity to create that space to really find out what went on. Then in more modern history, we can remember the Underground Railroad here in the United States that many congregations were involved in to help people who were enslaved, who were escaping slavery, and that can also be considered a form of sanctuary. And then in the modern centuries, in the 20th century, in the 1970s, there were many congregations who offered places of refuge for people who were protesting the Vietnam War, for people who were avoiding the draft of the time. And then probably the most famous example was the sanctuary movement of the 1980s that started right here in southern Arizona with a group of clergy that included the former pastor of the church I now attend, Southside Presbyterian, Reverend John Fife, and also, of course, included a lot of the people who were fleeing violence in El Salvador and Guatemala, who took up leadership roles once they arrived. Which are some of the people who are in this photo here. And this was a movement, this was an effort of over 500 congregations, including Christians, UUs, Jewish synagogues, who worked together to help get people all the way from the border all around the nation so that they could truly escape the violence they were fleeing, which our US government was actually contributing to. And this, all these examples kind of might remind you of things that I bring up later in terms of talking about how we as people who have access to resources and power and privilege can actually come alongside our brothers and sisters who may not have that access. And then this work of sanctuary really transformed in a lot of ways after the 80s. Of course, the biggest change was that the largest population of people coming across our southern border was from Mexico and no longer Central America. And this was primarily due to new economic policies, namely the North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed in 1994, which caused a huge amount of economic displacement. And so by the mid-2000s, there were thousands of undocumented folks who had come here as economic migrants who were now then facing increased enforcement, which was in part a reaction to the terror attack of September 11th. So this picture you're looking at is a picture of one of the huge protests that took place in 2006 and 2007 as a part of a movement to push Congress towards immigration reform. And there were, of course, many people of faith involved in that effort. And then what may be seen as kind of the first 21st century individual case of sanctuary were two cases of a woman named Elvira and a woman named Flor, who took sanctuary in Chicago churches. Their cases were not successful. They both lived in a church for about a year, and they ended up leaving, one of which I believe was deported. She's been able to come back since then. But it was this first opportunity or first try of someone actually publicly moving into a congregation to be able to stay here with their family. And so there were many lessons learned from Elvira and Flor in that time. And then more recently here in southern Arizona, again, there was a man who's pictured here, Daniel Neyor Ruiz, and his family. On his right is his wife, Carla, and on his left, his son, Carlos, who is a U.S. citizen. And he and his family came to a pro bono legal clinic that was started here in the Tucson community after SB 1070 hit the books. And he came to the clinic saying he had a final order of deportation, which the immigration system is very complicated. I'm not an attorney, but to my best understanding, once you have a final order, there's really no other option other than to move further into the shadows, which thousands of people do every day, or to go ahead and leave the country, which other people decide to do. And so when he came to the clinic, the attorney, Margot Cowan, who was one of the attorneys in the sanctuary movement of the 80s, had this idea of what if he were to take sanctuary? What if we were to try this again? Knowing how powerful it would be for him to actually move into the church where the movement of the 80s got its start. Our church had about 14,000 people sleep on its floors during the 80s. And of course, these were temporary stays. So this idea of someone staying longer so that their case could be arbitrated was a completely different model. And we didn't know how it would work out. But fortunately, after a lot of pressure on the local immigration office, Daniel was able to get a year-long stay of removal, which is essentially one of the only kinds of relief available to undocumented people like him. There really is no line to get into. There's no way to apply to become a resident, even if you have a U.S. citizen child. And so a stay is kind of the best you can do. And that issue is going to come up again when I mention a little bit about how things have changed under Trump. And then you may also have heard about this woman who's in the center of this picture, Rosa Robles Oreto, who took sanctuary also at Southside Presbyterian in the fall of 2014, so just over 3 years ago. And she actually lived at the church for 15 months, 461 days, fighting her deportation case. The local immigration office kind of dug in their heels and refused to grant her any kind of relief. They said, well, we won't touch you, we won't bother you, but she knew that she needed a real piece of paper to be able to prove that, because here in southern Arizona, we know the reality of someone getting pulled over for the color of their skin, and how that often leads to someone ending up in removal proceedings in the first place. And so Rosa, after those 15 months of incredible faith and struggle and courage with her husband Gerardo and her two sons Jose Emiliano and Gerardo Jr., she was able to get a confidential agreement with the government that closed her case and be able to return to her family. And she's a beloved member of our church community, and we are better people because of having known her and being able to advocate with her. And so really this work continued after Daniel and Rosa took sanctuary here. Within 6 months, from the spring of 14 to the fall of 14, 9 people had taken public sanctuary around the nation, from as far away from here in Arizona, Tucson and Phoenix, up to Portland, in Denver, in Austin, Texas, in Chicago, in Philadelphia. And it was a really powerful moment because in this time was when President Obama was looking at extending executive relief, deportation relief to the parents of U.S. citizens. And so this was a part of kind of weaving into the larger narrative that we need immigration reform. And if Congress is not going to act, we are pushing President Obama to act. And he did act in November of 2014. But unfortunately, that action to extend deportation relief to about 4 to 5 million people, our neighbors in this country, that governors from around the country put a stop to that by suing the government. So that never actually was implemented. And as we know now, his program for Dreamers, DACA, was just rescinded by President Trump. And so really this case-by-case advocacy of the years 2014 up until the election of Trump was a very strategic way to push immigration to actually follow their own policies. And so under the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security had set aside certain priorities for those people who should be deported. Whereas, of course, for us, we were advocating not one more, for no more deportations, but we also wanted to make it clear that immigration was, in fact, detaining and deporting people who did not meet these priority guidelines. So someone like Rosa, who had been in the country for over 15 years, who had had children here, and who had not had any kind of record, should not be a priority, and yet immigration was trying to deport her. So we were strategically using the house of worship as a place where someone could stay while they and a team of organizers and advocates and attorneys could work to actually get some kind of relief. And so during that time, of course, the congregation and community would provide hospitality, and there would be a strategy to push for some kind of prosecutorial discretion, which is the fancy term for some kind of relief. And that would come in a couple of different ways, like I mentioned before: a stay of removal, a deferred action, or actually getting their deportation case closed, which, to be clear, again, none of these actions actually granted any kind of status. It just took people from kind of a negative spot to a more neutral place. And so it was and the important thing to know as well is that the reason we were able to do this successfully in terms of law enforcement not entering a church is that the Obama administration had set forth a memo that really wrote down what had been tradition, what had been passed down policy, that no law enforcement would enter a house of worship to apprehend anyone. So we were strategically using that policy against them, saying you can't enter here. And so far there have not been any immigration agents or other law enforcement enter a congregation that has taken someone into sanctuary. And so this work really followed that trajectory of standing alongside individuals and families one at a time, which on a large scale is not helping a lot of people, but was really an opportunity for these families and individuals to be able to tell their story. And they knew that they were telling stories that were so similar to millions of other people. One of the powerful things about Rosa was that she understood that so amazingly, that she felt she was really speaking for all the other immigrant mothers like her who just wanted to be able to go to her son's baseball games. And so we really believe that this work of people of faith in this time, we had about 300 congregations involved at that point, was an opportunity for us to really exercise our principles and traditions and call to work for justice and to demand that our government really do better. And so once Trump was elected, which very few of us were expecting, we really got together again and said, well, what does it mean for us to do sanctuary now? And so we came up with this pledge just a couple of days after Trump was elected. And I'm just going to read it because I think the language is really powerful. As people of faith and people of conscience, we pledge to resist the newly elected administration's policy proposals to target and deport millions of undocumented immigrants and discriminate against other marginalized communities. We will open up our congregations and communities as sanctuary spaces for those targeted by hate and work alongside our friends, families, and neighbors to ensure the dignity and human rights for all people. So there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this statement is that we opened this idea up that there are more than just undocumented folks who would be affected by Trump's policies, which we've all seen. We were worried about a Muslim registry, which we've gotten a ban, not yet a registry, and hope never. Looking at further marginalization and oppression of our trans brothers and sisters, of our queer brothers and sisters. And so knowing that this work of sanctuary really exists outside just the sphere of working with undocumented people, even though that remains kind of the core of our work. And also that our larger vision was to really work for the dignity and human rights of all people. It's very easy to develop tunnel vision and to think this is the one thing we can do to help people. We need to make sure we have a shower in our church so someone can move in, right? That's really what I was excited to talk about today, is all the different ways that we as allies can be in solidarity with immigrant communities. So with this pledge, it really led many of us to think about how to expand our work and how to really, as I was talking about, to talk about sanctuary as a large umbrella under which we stand. And so here in Southern Arizona, Pastor Allison Harrington, who's the current pastor of Southside Presbyterian, she and a couple of us put together these principles for what our work looked like now. And I think these principles are important because in this time in which so many communities are being assaulted, in which the news that we're hearing every day is completely overwhelming, and in which more and more families are getting separated by detention and deportation. The numbers of deportations are up about 40 or 50%, and even higher when you look at the statistics for people with no criminal record. And so we're really seeing the numbers match up with what the principles of Trump's campaign and his administration are. And so it's important for us to really hold fast to our own principles. And so these four, I think, really help orient us around what our work is ahead and how we need to challenge ourselves. And so we really need to work on respecting and heeding the leadership of directly affected communities. We need to remain steadfast in our adherence to our own faith traditions. We need to not get caught up in the rhetoric around immigrants are economically beneficial. Dreamers are great because they're straight-A students. We need to hold fast to the fact that our faith traditions call us to respect all people. In my tradition as a Christian, that all people are made in the image of God. And that we need to talk at a narrative that's much different than even how some people who are allies to working for change talk about things. Yes, so we need to also be relentlessly imaginative and brave. This is a time in which creativity is a plus. When we're facing more and more threats to our communities, how do we creatively act so that we can really kind of put a stumbling block in the way of oppression, in the way of systems of oppression. And then finally, pledging our highest allegiance to the mandates of our faith and not to the laws of the land, which is where I think the witness of the 1980s movement was so powerful, because there were 8 people who actually risked many, many years in federal prison for the work that they did to help people get across. But for them, what was more important is what their faith called them to, what their conscience called them to. And there was a term that one of the almost philosophers of that movement named Jim Corbett, a Quaker, used, called civil initiative, that actually what they weren't doing was disobeying, but they were actually initiating their own version of how our laws and government and policies should work. So in this moment, we need to look beyond more than physical sanctuary. Not that physical sanctuary isn't important right now. We actually have 24 people living publicly in physical sanctuary around the nation. It's a lot more people than we expected would be actually willing to put their face out there in these trying times. But we really need to look beyond this, because the work of sanctuary really is bigger. Someone taking sanctuary really is a last resort. We don't want someone to have to move into a church indefinitely. It's a very scary thing to do. Talk to anyone who has done it. It's kind of being detained within a church. You can't leave the property, right? So we don't want that to happen. So what else can we do in our own communities that will help prevent people from having to do this? And so I kind of define this as using our access to power and resources to work for immigrant rights and ultimate liberation of immigrants in our society and world. So what power, what resources through the institutions of our congregations, of our larger denominational bodies, in our own lives. I know so many of you great folks are retired folks who have so many connections in your community and access to networks. And how do we use those strategically to work for immigrant rights in conversation, of course, with these immigrant communities? And so I just put a little bit of definition of how I define solidarity, which I think is really how we can orient ourselves in this time, is how we work as one for a common cause, right? And so we are people who feel compelled by our faith, who feel compelled by our conscience, who feel compelled as people who many times have access to all of these resources. Who have the privilege of white skin, of education, of being upper middle class or middle class, of documentation. So how do we work with immigrant communities for a common cause? And so sanctuary can still look like this. These are 4 pictures of people who've taken sanctuary under the Trump administration. At the top left is, in the yellow shirt, is Pastor Jose Chicas, who is in sanctuary in Durham, North Carolina. He is a pastor, and he's been in this country for about 30 years and is trying to stay here with his family. In the top right is a woman named Amanda Morales. She is living in sanctuary in Washington Heights, Manhattan, New York City. And she is a young mother from Guatemala who fled here, is an asylum seeker, and has been removed from this country. And she is currently in sanctuary. In the bottom left is Jeanette Vizquera with her family. And she was in sanctuary in Denver for a couple of months, and she was actually able to get a stay of removal. So that was one success that we've seen. And then in the bottom right is David, who was in sanctuary in Reno, Nevada. He actually also was able to get a stay. He has a case of extreme hardship, a very critical heart condition for which he receives treatment here in the United States, and would not be able to receive that treatment back in his home state of Aguascalientes, Mexico. And so he was able to get a stay, and hopefully will continue to be able to get those stays removed so that he can stay in this country. So sanctuary can continue to look like this, right? I don't want to tell you all that this is something that has gone away. There are people that are still seeking this final last resort. But I also want to open up your mind to the other many ways that we can be in solidarity with immigrant communities. So just to highlight a couple of campaigns that have happened over the years, which some of these images may look familiar, in solidarity with 11 million undocumented immigrants, really pushing the point that we can't fragment up our communities and say, this is the group of people who deserve to stay, and this is the group of people who don't. A lot of DACA recipients, dreamers who I know, say they feel terrible that so many times they're talked about as if they're put on a pedestal and then their parents are thrown under the bus, right? Their parents are the criminals who brought them over, even using the language, these were people who were brought illegally by their parents. How about these are people who came with their families to find better opportunities, right? How can we use language to really lift up the stories of all the people and really dream that we can create a system in which all the people who are living among us, who are our friends, our neighbors, go to school with our kids, can stay here and have a dignified life. And so part of this messaging has been the Not One More campaign, which started in 2013 out of Phoenix, out of the National Day Laborers Organizing Network. And really with this idea that we need to push beyond even the liberal tendency to say that people with felonies should be deported and people without should be able to stay. And then in the top left is what's called the Dream Nine. They were 9 dreamers who I believe 3 of them crossed back into Mexico on this day in, I believe, the summer of 2013. And then 6 of them had rather been deported back to Mexico or had left for some kind of family reason. And they actually they did an action where they all presented themselves at the border on one day in Nogales, asking for humanitarian parole. So as a way to really say that just because the Deferred Action Program was available, it wasn't available to all of them, and that we need to push beyond these frameworks that we create, right? So it was a very powerful action that happened here locally. and continues to inspire those of us who are trying to work alongside these communities. Then in the bottom right is a picture of the, it says this, the Workers Center of Southside. They were at an action, and this is a group of day laborers who organize for themselves and also try to get work every day, right? And so it's powerful as a person of faith, a person who knows many of these guys, and can support them. And so when they're doing fundraisers to help get someone out of detention, or they're showing up at the jail where someone's being detained, to be able to show up and stand alongside them. And then on the left side of your screen, the Basta Arpaio campaign, which was one of the best things to happen in November of 2016, is that immigrant communities primarily organized in Phoenix, in Maricopa County, and were able to successfully convince enough people that Sheriff Joe Arpaio should be out, that he is a very cruel human being who not only cruel by moral standards, but actually breaking the law. Imprisoning people in horrid conditions, and racially profiling people who appeared to be Latino. And so this was an effort that I think not enough allies supported. I know I should have gone up there and helped canvass more than I did. And so just really thinking about the ways that we can support the work that's existing, that immigrant communities are doing. And so in a minute, when I talk about some tips, kind of be thinking about some of these campaigns that are going on. And we really have these immigrant communities, primarily the organizing group Puente, which means bridge, in Phoenix, for doing all of this work to really gain a concrete win. And even though Trump pardoned Arpaio, he's not sheriff anymore. So that is a huge, huge win for all people here in Arizona, but especially for the Latino and especially the Latino undocumented community. And then on the right, we have recent campaigns by the United We Dream group, which is one of the primary groups organized by people around my age who are dreamers, some who have DACA, some who don't, that were really pushing hard to say, Trump, do not rescind DACA. And that there have been a lot of politicians who've said, well, we need legislation, but we continue to not see legislation be passed. And so to really push for and say, we need this executive relief until we can get reform. And so there were a lot of people of faith, a lot of allies who stood by, and really many people who risked arrest at the White House to protect DACA. And these are the kind of, once again, the kind of campaigns that we can support as allied people of faith. A big piece of this, I think, which is one of the hardest things to talk about and to think about for ourselves, is to really think about the savior and paternalistic mindset. So any of the ways in which we're engaging in this work with immigrant communities, we need to remember that first principle, which I showed you all, to respect the leadership of directly affected communities. And so, for instance, if you were in Phoenix in the fall of 2016 and you were to show up to a Puente meeting and you were to say, what should I be doing? I want to help. They would say, we need you to go talk to your people, your other white people, and let them know what's wrong with Sheriff Arpaio, and we need to vote him out of office, right? So it's not that we always have to go to that community, but it's just understanding that we need to be paying attention to the resources available to us, and to really ground our work in relationship, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The other piece with this is to recognize and acknowledge the power dynamic that comes up in working with immigrant communities. It's very easy for those of us, even young people like me, to walk into a room that's full of people of color, undocumented folks, and to think that I know everything and that I can just walk in and tell everybody else what to do, right? I've actually never done that, but there are small ways in which I have exercised my privilege in the wrong way, and contributed to the oppression, the oppressive system that exists. The other piece to remember is that we allies did not invent and do not own this work. So the work of sanctuary we often really craft as, look at these great white male pastors who did this great thing in the 80s. Yes, they did a great thing, right? But this work of sanctuary, this work of providing hospitality, has always been owned, has always belonged to people of color, to the oppressed people themselves, right? To queer people within the queer liberation movement, to women within the women's movement, right? So recognizing that we are a part of something larger and that, like I said, we can access our resources and privilege and power, but that we need to maintain the center of this in the communities themselves. Other pieces, what does the local immigrant community ask of us? That was something I just talked about in terms of how we can get involved locally. And then to consider deeper training on racism, white supremacy, and power and privilege, and to really think about the intersections between the immigrant rights struggle and many others, like the movement for Black Lives, talking about incarceration, how immigration detention is one of the biggest pieces of, numbers are rising the most of people incarcerated are immigrants, and many other ways that these issues intersect, right? And then finally, that we're going to make mistakes, but we need to learn from them, and to not go, not to primarily lead or, to not lead out of a feeling of guilt, but out of a feeling of solidarity and a feeling of anger for the system that exists, and also the anger even that we can take over sometimes and do the wrong thing, right? I'm consistently reflecting on interactions I have, on the work that I do, to try to figure out how I can do it better. And so then when we're thinking about working with immigrant communities, relationships are the key. Here in Southern Arizona, I was very lucky because when I showed up to be a part of this work, I was part of a church, Southside Presbyterian, that already had really wonderful relationships with the undocumented community, with our Day Laborer Center, and with other groups of undocumented folks who organize. So I didn't really have to start those relationships with my own personal relationship, but an institutional relationship, right? So really thinking about how that our first step is always relationship, is saying, hey, do you need help at your meeting? Do you need childcare? Do you need a space to meet, right? Really saying that I'm going to show up for you and what you need, and not just go forward with some plan that actually might be totally off the course of what's needed in the moment, right? Going back to heeding their leadership, can't say that enough, can't say that enough to myself. Offering resources and support. Some of the things that have been asked of us here are to provide space for meetings, are to provide childcare, are to print out flyers, really to do that backstage work. I think most of us, we really see ourselves at the front, and we need to think more how we can be behind the scenes, behind the curtain, doing the support work, doing the legwork, doing the logistics, so that the people in the affected community are able to be at the front and to pursue the policy or campaign that they know they need to, right? And then finally, to really find your niche, but not at their expense, right? That's really important. So one of the things that our local sanctuary coalition here is starting to work on is to pressure our Pima County Board of Supervisors to institutionalize an office for non-citizen defense, to provide legal representation for anyone who's in removal proceedings, meaning they're looking at being deported. That's something that we, with all this access to power and privilege, can work on. That would be a huge help to our undocumented community while they pursue other campaigns, right? So that's one of the ways in which you can look at what's something that you can work on, you as an ally community, you with access to certain kinds of networks can do. I know that I've heard from the groups that are working in schools to support undocumented students that there's a need for really talking with administrators about certain kinds of policies that are zero tolerance, that actually lead to someone's family member being deported, or that student being deported, right? So what are those connections we have to have a conversation with the administrator, to find out what their policies are and what needs to change. Because they will sit down with that student, right? But they're going to listen to us, because that's how our world currently works, right? We want to transform that, but in the meantime, we can use that privilege to push for change. And just to give you kind of a few examples, the Sanctuary Coalition up in Portland, they call themselves Emerge, Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice. They met with immigrant-led groups right after the election, and this was the list of things that those groups asked them for. And as you'll see, none of those things are physical sanctuary. So just to give you a couple of examples, that they were asking for workshops and a way to make an action plan for if a family is detained or deported, knowing where to turn for help. So that might mean sanctuary, right? Or it might mean someone can just show up to the church office and be there for 3 hours and then leave. To create rapid response teams to respond to raids and support structures to address larger hate crimes, which we know there was a recent horrific hate crime in the Portland area that 2 allies showed up and risked their own lives. One of them did die standing up for their 2 Muslim sisters. And then finally, financial resources. I know many of us have access to those financial resources, and they're important. If we can use them, we really should. And so what now? When I talk about with congregations and when people are thinking about how they can engage in this work, I kind of have these 3 C's, which I wanted to kind of ask myself some challenging questions about how I normally talk about this. So what do you feel your call is, right? What do you feel your call to do? Do you feel called to really work with your board at your church to try to have the space to provide physical sanctuary? Do you feel like you want to get involved in a local campaign? What do you feel called to? But I also would challenge myself and you all with what shapes your call? How does power and privilege shape the call you feel? So never to do something at the affected community's expense, right? And then after you think about what you feel called to do and to kind of moderate that with some challenging questions is what is your capacity? What can I do? And then also thinking about what should I do? Maybe you can single-handedly work on a campaign to get something amazing done. I don't have a good example, but should you do that, right? And also it's important to balance out call and capacity because sometimes they conflict. And so we need to figure out how those 2 work together. And I think so many people in this moment are so focused on, we need to become a sanctuary church. We need to have the space to offer. And then I talk to them and they say, oh, we're all ready. We made our declaration. And I'm like, have you talked to anyone in the immigrant community? They're like, oh, no. Okay. Right? So how do we really back up like 1,000 steps and say relationships, 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 right? For me, at the end of the day, if I know that I have figured out what people are going to watch the kids at the next meeting for the protection networks, that I feel accomplished because I know that I have supported that group of people who had a very simple ask, right? So really thinking about our call, our capacity with these challenging questions, and then finally what our commitment is. So on the next page, I have a couple of ideas of what you can do in this moment. Educate yourselves, right? We don't need to go to the immigrant community and say, can you tell me again why you couldn't just get in line, right? That information is available online. There's excellent resources, which I'm happy to share with you. There's a graphic, really great graphic that shows if your sister is a citizen versus if you have a child. It's a very complicated and really unjust system. The wait time, I was talking with the ACLU lawyer down here, and he said the wait time right now for applying for a green card, if you have a U.S. citizen sibling, is they're processing applications from 1996. So, right, there's no line, even if you do have that connection. So educate yourselves, start a book study. There's really, really excellent resources available. Once again, I can share you a list that comes from Border Links, immigration education organization here in Tucson. And I know church groups love book studies, so hey, can't go wrong with that. Providing financial assistance to immigrant-led groups, right? If they have a fundraiser, if they're trying to raise money to get someone out of detention on bond. Bonds are really expensive, especially now judges are setting them really high rates, up to $15,000. I mean, no kidding, right? Like very few of us could just put up that money. Accompany asylum seekers to court. There are many places that have set up systems. I wouldn't just say show up to court and be like, are you an asylum seeker? Can I help you? Right? You have to develop that relationship, but that's one way to plug in and to really support someone. To set up or participate in a rapid response network. I guess rapid raid response network. I have a mistake. We do have one of those here in Tucson, and I'm pretty sure there's one set up in Phoenix. I don't know about 5 staff, but that's something you could definitely look for. offer to provide childcare or space for immigrant groups to meet, and then join local organizing efforts and develop relationships in your community. And so I would just ask you as I finish up so that we have enough time for questions, to just think about one thing that you want to do, whether that's just reading to understand more about what's going on with immigration. Like I said, I'm happy to share resources, or if that's to think about some money that I know we're getting towards the end of the year, money you can give. There's amazing organizations. I would highly, highly recommend Puente in Phoenix, doing amazing work. I have a bunch of places I can recommend here in Tucson. I don't know Flagstaff that well, but I'm happy to do some research if you feel like you can't figure that out. And to really think about what your next step might be. And I'm happy to be a support resource. Sometimes I do webinars with people all around the country, so I'm pretty close by. I'm happy to come visit and talk to whoever, and happy to support you in whatever way. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. This gave me more things to think about, more learning to do for myself. And I would just say that, I think this quote is where it all resides for me, is that this is about our collective liberation. It's very easy to think, oh, well, we have the power. We don't, it's this obviously we need to do what's right for this other group of people, but we're fine, right? Well, there's something that is inherently wrong, I would say, for my tradition, sinful, about a society that operates in ways that are so oppressive to the majority of people, right? And so we need to really collectively imagine that we need to work, that we all are liberated, that even those of us with a lot of power and privilege are all liberated by working for liberation of oppressed communities, right? And when we do that in the right way, it's very, very powerful. And I will say from experience, the reason I'm able to say that the most accomplished I feel is providing childcare is because of the internal work that I've done as a white person, as a college-educated person, to really think about what's most important. And I think there are many people who participate in this work for their whole lives, and they don't do a lot of that internal work. And so I would just encourage you to think about the ways that you may actually be hindering the work towards liberation, and to really think about how we can imagine a better world for us all, right? Because a world in which all of these amazing groups of immigrants from all around the world, it's really easy in Arizona to think about just people from Latin America, but refugee groups, the amazing contributions and value that they bring to our society, and to imagine a country in which, I don't know any of these people because they were not allowed in, because there's a 50-foot wall from, the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. I would not be the person who I am, right? So I just commend to you that we keep visioning and we keep thinking about transformation, and that we don't let the pessimism, I think even within more liberal, progressive circles, get to us, because we are people of faith who can imagine. We have principles we abide by. We have scriptures we can look towards to really imagine a different world, a world in which the Spirit or God or the Creator, however you look at the holy, imagines for us. So how can we imagine that with the Creator? Okay, so I know I'm a talker, so I tried my best. Sorry, Allie.
No, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy Beth.
Sure.
I certainly was taking notes throughout of new ideas and things to think about for myself, challenges and points of opportunity. I want to open a space now for at least a few minutes for questions. And so feel free to unmute yourself and let's see, and go ahead. Questions that you have for Amy Beth, things that you want to know more about, or clarifications? Do y'all have any reactions or any new thoughts that were sparked in you from what Amy Beth shared?
This is Roz in Flagstaff.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Amy Beth, for your really helpful presentation. There is some work being done up here with our immigrant community. And I think we're also fortunate in the way that the leadership of our law enforcement agencies, that they appear to be respectful of our immigrant communities and I can only speak for the leadership of those agencies, but they really seem to be committed to making that respect real. And there is work being done in our Northern Arizona Interfaith Council. There is a team that is working on immigration issues with the community, and they are working beside the community. And there are also inroads into the schools, particularly secondary schools, to encourage immigrant families to consider possibilities for post-secondary education for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some good things happening, and my own view is that we really, in order to actually affect some change, we have to work together. And I think that UU is a very small denomination,
Mm-hmm.
and even though in the bigger cities like Tucson and Phoenix and the metro areas, the churches are bigger, especially up here, we really must work with other groups too.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate your point of view. We call ourselves at Beacon Social Justice Allies,
Mm-hmm.
in our committee, and I like your terminology of accompany members of the immigrant community in our work.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe some of the others from our group would have some questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah, please, if you can see on the screen, my email is on there. So feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to talk over the phone or in any other way to answer questions. Yes, thank you for sharing about what's happening up in Flagstaff.
So we had a question come in through the chat box asking, if a congregation does not already have a relationship with immigrant-led groups, where should someone start?
Okay, yeah. I get a lot of emails from people around the nation who are like, how do I, essentially they're asking me to Google something for them. That's kind of the first step, is to figure out whether it's through Google or other networks you have about what's existing in your community. Even in the smallest of towns, there's usually some kind of refugee group or immigrant group. It might be a legal clinic. If you have a university in your area, usually they have an immigration legal clinic, if they have a law school, of course. And yeah, just to do some of your own research and then reach out to them. Send them an email, give them a call, say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I'm with this congregation, or I'm on my own and I really want to get involved. What would you recommend? And that's really as simple and also as hard as as the process is, right? But like I said, honoring the existing work. So I tell some people are already very involved with supporting refugee families. If you're already doing that, do not abandon that work for something else, right? There's a lot of ways to do this work of justice. But also, I mean, I don't talk much about refugees, but some of these ideas matter there too in terms of how we go about a relationship with people who are coming from all over the world. And while they have residency, they have legal status, they still face a lot of oppression and challenges, right? So I would say, yeah, use Google and then reach out, attend a meeting, let them know what you might have to offer. Hey, we're a congregation. We have these meeting rooms open. Do you need them? Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. And yeah, I think language can definitely be a barrier. That was something I didn't list, which I meant to. Try to learn the language of whatever group that you want to work with, right? I know it's hard to learn a second language, but even if you can just learn a little bit of Spanish or a little bit of Arabic, people really appreciate that you are trying and that you're not just expecting them to learn English, right? Because that goes back to the power dynamics, is this assumption. Yes, of course, if people get along in society, they need to learn English. But I think within the context of a relationship, saying, I'm going to try to learn your language too. That's a way that I can be in solidarity with you.
One thing I hear you saying, Amy Beth, is that it's hard to start those relationships, and that's important to be conscious of power and privilege and all those dynamics. And also that if I can infer a little bit, that it's easy to get caught up in those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And so there comes a point where you just have to take the step and say hello, or show up to the meeting, or mm-hmm. or try, introduce yourself and get started on the relationship.
Sure. Yes.
Is that fair?
That was a good inference.
Yeah, Hannah says courage. It requires some courage to take that step.
Sure. Mm-hmm. There's still rooms that I can enter that I feel totally overwhelmed. Like, should I be here? Is this okay? Right? But I will give you an example. When we started our coalition work this year, we invited the local protection networks, these groups of undocumented people that organize, to present about the work they do. And they were just so encouraged to be in a room full of mostly white allies who cared to listen to what they have to say, right? Even though we need an interpretation for most people, right? So it's really the small things, right? Because so many of these people, what they experience from someone who is white and middle class usually is not a lot of respect, is a lot of negativity and even, hatred. So it's really like it's the most basic kindergarten stuff that we need to work on, taken to the next level, of course, with analysis of like unlearning a lot of these things that we've learned about how we know best, and we have the programs and we and all of those things. Yeah.
That's some basic steps to start. That's
yes.
Good. That's encouraging.
Hopefully that's
it's encouraging
helpful.
To me. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts from folks or questions as we draw to a close here, wanting to respect the time?
I have a question, Amy Beth.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
You said you're a talker.
Mm-hmm.
So do you find that you have to minimize your tendency to be a talker to downplay your privilege?
That's a good question. I have to balance those choices that come based on personality versus like power, right? So I think it's a mixture of both. It's just kind of recognizing the moment, okay, am I talking too much because I think that what I have to say is more important than what someone in the affected community has to say? And just figuring out what spaces to be in. But I would say generally speaking, going in, working with immigrant communities, going in with an intention of listening, I would say is key. So yes, that's a great thing you bring up, that I do think about that. And I think the fact that, so I do speak Spanish conversationally, not fluently, but being forced to communicate in my second language is an always humbling experience, and is a good reminder of what people face every day who don't speak English as their native language. So that to me is a reminder of like when I didn't catch 4 of the words and I only kind of understood what's happening, that I have to ask for help. And that's not something I have to do a lot in a society that kind of rewards what I've achieved, right? So thank you for that. Yeah. And I would just say highlight the website that's on this page, and these the Emerge website is the Portland Coalition. They have a really excellent compilation of resources. I highly commend that. And then if you want to follow what the Sanctuary Movement is doing, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. That's really where we post about you can read about all the different public sanctuary cases, and about work the different coalitions are doing. We have about 20 coalitions nationwide, probably even more. It's been growing exponentially. We've gone from about 300 congregations to about 1,000 since Trump was elected. So this is an important time for those of us who are allies to get involved, but to get involved in the right way.
Thank you, Amy Beth, and thank you everyone for your questions and thoughts. I would add one more resource to this page, which is the UUA Love Resists campaign. And so you can find that just by Googling #LoveResists, or the website is uua.org/loveresists. And as part of that campaign that we're able to offer these webinars throughout the coming 6 or 8 months, including this webinar on expanded sanctuary. And part of what the UUA and UU College of Social Justice and some other big groups are offering, including UUJAZ. Part of what we're working towards is recognizing that there are many vulnerable communities, many communities under attack, many communities that are being criminalized to a greater degree than ever before, and that what we really hope for, what we dream about in this this call to be relentlessly imaginative, what we imagine is a world where there is safety for all people, and that we want to keep the focus on impacted communities and take our lead from them and get to work to make that world a reality as quickly and as doggedly as possible. Amy Beth mentioned a lot of different campaigns and organizations across the state of Arizona, and we heard some more from Roz. And I know that you each carry a lot of wisdom with you about your communities and contexts. So there are lots of places to get involved. These resources, again, on this page are good places to learn more and to get new ideas. Amy Beth is available. You see her email address at the bottom of the slide. I'm also available. It's Allison, ALISON, at UUJAZ.org for more information or to get some of these resources. And as usual, I'll email out the recording of this webinar. I would encourage you to share it with folks who couldn't make it. And perhaps Amy Beth will email me a list of resources she mentioned from Borderlinks, and I can send that out as well. So we'll wrap up here, having just opened this conversation about expanded sanctuary, hearing the call to check our privilege and to really think about what is shaping our call and what our capacity is and what commitments we're willing to make and excited to make as we work for justice. So thank you all again for calling in, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today on October 8th at 4 p.m. And I will hopefully see you all there. So thank you again, and thank you again, Amy Beth.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.